The latest polls explain to us that about 7 to 7.5% of the United States of America identifies as atheist or agnostic. The word atheist means atheos. If you put a in front of a Greek word, it means no. Theos is the Greek word for God. Atheos means no God. About 2.5 to 3% of the people who were polled say, we do not believe in God, you shouldn't believe in God either, and we're going to spend a large portion of our time explaining to you that you need to get rid of that belief. About another 4.5% are identified as agnostic. Agnostic, you put a in front of the Greek word gnosis, G-N-O-S-I-S, which means knowledge. That's where we get our English word knowledge. Agnostic means no knowledge. What it means is we don't think there's enough information to say if there is a God or not. We think there's probably not. And so we're just going to live like there's not, and we'll let it all work itself out in the wash. So you're looking at about 7%. Now, at first, 7% of 330 million doesn't sound like that many. Until you start breaking the numbers down a little bit, that gives you right at about 22 million. About 22 million. Now, when you look at 22 million, if you were to take the adults in the United States, you got 330 million total. Adults, you've probably got, you're looking at about 230 million, maybe 250. You're really looking at about 10% of the adult population. Now, let's put it in a little more perspective. If I were to ask you how many people live in Birmingham, Alabama, you would tell me in and around, if you were to look it up in the city limits, there's about 457,000, something along those lines, last time I checked, if I recall correctly. But if you count all the areas like Adamsville and the areas around it, you're looking at about 1 million. Now let that sink in just a minute. You got 1 million people, and if you're driving through Birmingham at 5 o'clock, it seems like about 12 million people, especially if you're from out of town. Now let's multiply Birmingham, Alabama, and all of its surrounding areas by 22. And fill those 22 cities with people, and every one of those people is a person who says, I don't believe in God, or I don't think there's enough evidence to say there is one. Is that a lot of people? It is. In fact, when I say a lot of people, what I mean by that is there are more people in the United States of America right now tonight who claim not to believe in God than there ever have been in the history of the United States. Now here's what that means. The generation that you're looking at the backs of their heads on these first 2 rows right here, 3, this generation is dealing with unbelief to a greater extent than any group of people in the history of our nation. Think it's something that we need to discuss? Think it's something that we need to prepare them for? Do you think it's something that we need to be always ready to give a defense about? It certainly is. Now, here's how much the situation has changed. If you were to ask me when I was growing up, if we had 100 kids in Columbia, Tennessee that were members of the church, and you were to have said, hey, how many of you know someone who doesn't believe in God? Out of 100 of us, you could have probably counted on one finger how many people did know someone actually by name who did not believe in God, right? I was at the Madison Church of Christ last summer, looking at 3 months ago now. Had 86 kids in the basement level there where I was teaching the Wednesday night class. Out of 86, I said, how many of you know someone who doesn't believe in God? So many hands went up that I couldn't count them all. I said, okay, let's try this again. Put your hands down. How many of you don't? About 5 hands went up. Out of 86 kids, 5 kids did not know someone who didn't believe in God. That means about 80 to 81 of them did. Now that's in 20 years. And so what we've got to ask ourselves is, how can we challenge this secular mindset? What can we do to make a difference in a world where there are so many people who don't even know or think that there's a God, and who certainly don't go to the Bible for an answer? How do we approach that? And so what I'd like to give us tonight is, number one, you need to recognize that it's the case. No longer do religious discussions start, for the most part, hey, do you know what Acts chapter 2 verse 38 says? Now, don't get me wrong. I love Acts chapter 2 verse 38. Love 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 15 and then 21. I love those verses, and they mean a whole lot to me, but that's not where religious discussions start. It is where they used to start when I was a kid. We would say, hey, you have read Acts chapter 2 verse 38, and they would say, yeah, but what about Romans 10, 9 and 10, where it says, if you believe with your heart and confess with your mouth, then you'll be saved. And then we would say, yeah, but over in Romans chapter 6, it says these people were already, remember, don't you know, as many of you as were baptized into Christ were buried with Him in death? And we would go through that discussion. That's not the discussion anymore. The discussion now is, hey, do you know what Acts? What are you talking about? You know the book of Acts in the Bible. Oh yeah, I think I read the Bible as a kid, maybe once or twice. I don't really know why anybody keeps up with the Bible anyway. It's kind of an outdated book. That's how the discussion often goes. And so here's our question. What can we do to make a difference in a secular world? Well, you've got what I call the golden text of Christian apologetics. And of course, you guys know when somebody says, Kyle, hey, where do you work? And I say, I work at Apologetics Press. You get that little look. And they say, well, Apostolic Express. I mean, what? I said, no, not Apostolic Express, Apologetics Press. I told somebody that the other day, and the little lady pulled me aside, and she's like, I got a personal question to ask you. I'm not telling you how much I weigh. Forget it. No, I'm not. No. She said, she got this little grin on her face. She said, what are y'all apologizing for? You know, that's kind of what you're thinking. You got 1 Peter 3, verse 15. But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is within you with meekness and fear. Now, that verse says, always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you. Do you know I've been working at Apologetics Press now for going on 17 years, since I got out of college, and I've never been invited to deliver a sermon on idolatry. Never once. No one has ever called me and said, Kyle, you know, at our congregation, we got a lot of people that are taking their gold, having it melted down, and having little statues graven for their home worship services. We need you to come do a sermon or a talk on idolatry. Never had a single person ask me. Do you know that if somebody invited me to speak on idolatry, I would say yes, just so I can't say that anymore? Just so I can say, you know what, I've been working 17 years and I had one group say, come speak to us on little gold statues. Nobody asked me to speak on little gold statues. If I was in India right now, would I be doing sermons on little gold statues? Yes, I would. In fact, not only would I be doing 1 or 2 or 3, but the nation, the country of India as a whole is almost entirely given over to idolatry. They say that there are 3 million idols in the nation or the country of India. And if you're going to do any mission work over there, you've got to be prepared to speak on idolatry. Not here. I don't speak on idolatry. Now, just so happens that I get so many calls every single week that I can't go be a part of all the invitations that I have to speak on things like the existence of God and dinosaurs. You ever thought about that? Why in the world would dinosaurs be the number one question that people in the United States have as it relates to God and the Bible. Been working at AP for 17 years now almost. We get questions about everything. Hey, what about the existence of God? Hey, was Jesus actually a real historical person? Hey, what about evolution? Hey, what about, the number one question we get? What about dinosaurs? Do you know that when I was growing up, if someone had said, Kyle, you're going to travel literally the world. I was in Panama this last summer. I was in Wisconsin this weekend. 2 weeks ago, I was in Sullivan, Illinois. And if they said, Kyle, you're going to speak all over the world on how dinosaurs and the Bible fit together, I would have laughed at them and said, are you kidding me? I've never in all of my life, up to the time I was 22, 23, 25, 20, probably about 25 is the cutoff, since I started working at AP, never heard one lesson on dinosaurs. And yet, I got an email from a young mother. She said, I need your help. She said, I have 2 children, ages 15 and 13, and they are losing their faith. And dinosaurs were where they started losing it. Now, for 6 hours, like Ashley said today, we had about 310 kids that sat and listened to us talk about how they've been told that dinosaurs and humans were separated by millions and millions of years. But when you go back to the book of Genesis and you see the story of creation, Exodus chapter 20 verse 11 says that for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and on the 7th day He rested. If He made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them in 6 days, would that include dinosaurs? Absolutely, positively. And on what day did God create humans? Day 6. On what day did He create all land-living animals? Day 6. Are Tyrannosaurus rexes land-living animals? They absolutely positively are. So on what day did God make dinosaurs? Day 6, along with man. It's a scientific fact, it's a biblical fact, and it's a historic fact. Now, I'm not going to go through all of that tonight. Like we said, we gave out 300 and, going on 20. I think I brought an extra 10. One grandmother came and said she wanted a copy for 4 of her or 5 of her grandkids, I think. And then we had the teachers who all came, and the librarian said, you guys don't have to stay for this. You can go back to your classroom. And they said, yeah, but we want a book. And so they stayed, and all the teachers got a book, and every one of the kids got a book, and we answered the dinosaur question. Did you ever think that that's where we would be now? That in order to get a person to God, you'd have to start talking about dinosaurs? I never did. Frankly, never thought that that's where we would be. But one thing about Jesus and the apostles, they always started where a person was. You remember Paul, Acts chapter 17, on Mars Hill, the Areopagus, he stands up to this idol-worshiping group who worship so many idols that they're afraid they left one out. And there's this idol to the unknown God, and Paul stands up and he says, I'd like to commend you guys. Whoa, you're going to commend these people? They're worshiping idols. He says, I'd like to commend you guys. Y'all are very religious. That just so happens, the one God that you don't quite know enough about, that unknown God, He's the God I'm going to tell you about. Now let's direct all your religious attention on Him. But isn't it interesting that Paul starts with the very idols that the Athenians are worshiping and says, now let's go from there. And then ends them up with Jesus Christ, who he says is coming to judge the world in righteousness. Now, I'll tell you what we do with things like dinosaurs. We start them with dinosaurs. And let me tell you what dinosaurs have been used for. You well know what they've been used for. If someone were to say, what's the main teaching that is piggybacked or strapped to the back of dinosaurs, you know that it's millions of years of evolution. But did you know that in the book of Job, In Job chapters 40, 41, and 42, God starts talking about a creature called a behemoth. And God says, Job, I want you to look at the behemoth that I made along with you. He eats grass like an ox. His strength is in his stomach muscles, and he swings his tail like a cedar. Do you know the description of the behemoth matches more closely a long-necked, long-tailed, plant-eating dinosaur than any other creature that's ever existed? Now, here's what's interesting to me about that. Number one, there are no accidental words in the Bible. When God says to Job, look at the behemoth that I made along with you, he knew that sentence was going to be very important. And do you remember what God's point was? God was coming down to talk to Job because Job had challenged him. Remember that? Job had said, God, I don't think you treat me fair. I'm paraphrasing. But Job was sitting in an ash heap with boils from the bottom of his foot to the top of his head. He was scraping the boils off with a broken piece of pottery, and the boils were filled with worms. And he's looking at his friends, and his friends are telling him he must have done some terrible, horrible sin, and that's why he's where he is. And Job says, no, I'm not perfect. I know I've sinned, but I hadn't sinned any worse than you guys. And y'all are still finely dressed, and you still got all your stuff, and I'm sitting on this ash heap with boils, and something's not right. So he talks to God, and he says, God, this doesn't seem fair, and I'd like to talk to you, but I know that if you come down and talk to me, just your mere presence is going to kill me. And so I'll make you a deal. If you don't blast me with your presence, then I think you're going to see that I've got a real point here. So God comes down, starts asking Job some questions. Job, where were you when I hung the world on nothing? Did Job know where he was when that happened? Job, can you make the sun do its circuit every day and make a deal with the morning so that the sun comes up every day? Can't do that either, huh? Well, strike two for you, Job. Job, what about feeding all the animals? I mean, I've got one dog and my little daughter's got a hamster. And I have trouble making sure I remember enough food for my daughter's hamster. What about feeding all the animals every day all over the world? Job, can you do that? Strike three. He gives him a few more than three, though. He gets down to about strike 50. But then he comes to the behemoth and he says, Job, I want you to look at the behemoth that I made along with you. He is the first of the ways of God. And he talks about this huge creature that swings his tail like a cedar, and it describes a massive animal that looks just like a dinosaur. Now here's the question. What was God using dinosaurs to do? To bring glory to Him. And yet that's not what dinosaurs are used for now, is it? In fact, when I stand up and I talk about a Tyrannosaurus Rex that had a 5.5-foot skull, you should see a third grade class of 56 kids sitting on the floor of their library, and I pull out a replica of a 13-inch dinosaur tooth that the Tyrannosaurus Rex skull was filled with 60 of them. And I explained that a Tyrannosaurus Rex could bite off a single bite of meat that weighed 500 pounds in one bite. Do you think they're interested in that? And then when you come in with the punchline of, and God created that creature. Well, isn't that what all creatures were always designed to do? Bring glory to God. Yes. Especially the most amazing, biggest land-living creatures ever to have walked the earth, dinosaurs. Well, like I say, it's time we take those creatures back. And we use them for what they were designed to be used for, and that's to show God's glory. And so I use those this evening just to give you the simple point of reference that we need to meet our secular culture where it is. Second thing I'd like you to understand is that how you respond to our culture's questioning is often scrutinized, and the impact it makes is often more important than what you say. It's how you say it. Now, I want you to go back there to 1 Peter chapter 3. But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you with meekness and fear. You see, lots of times I'm convinced that the skeptical community is putting this out to see if you really are going to respond like a Christian. And sadly, it's the case that lots of times in our eagerness to defend our God, we sometimes leave off the meekness and fear aspect of the instruction. Let me give you an example. It wasn't long ago, it was a little while ago now, actually several years. The government of the city of New York was working on the Ground Zero Museum. And they were looking to see what they were going to put in the Ground Zero Museum. And there was a cross-shaped I-beam structure that when the Twin Towers fell, that cross-shaped I-beam structure stayed standing up. And so lots of people looked at that as a symbol of God and the crucifixion and the cross. And they were going to put it, they wanted to put it in the museum that was going to be built there at Ground Zero. And this was on Fox News. And so on Fox News, you see the Freedom from Religion Foundation from Madison, Wisconsin, about 2.5 hours away from where I was this last weekend. The Freedom from Religion Foundation goes around the country and sues people for putting religious things in public view. They're in, I'm trying to think exactly where it was. I think it was either Marshfield or Spencer. Marshfield, Wisconsin. The guy who was driving me around this last weekend drove me into the middle of the town square, and there was a religious statue right there in the middle of the town square. Well, it had a fence around it, and it had private property posted all around it, and there was a big sign that said, "This statue is not endorsed by the government of the local Marshfield whatever." Well, the Freedom from Religion had come over and sued the Marshfield, city council, or whatever it was, to say, you can't put that statue up. And so they sold it to an individual, and the individual put up private property, and they left the statue up and everything, but all that rigmarole was so they could leave the statue up there in the center of town. Now, these guys sued the it was the city government of New York, and said you can't put the cross in the Ground Zero Museum. They're on Fox News, and it gets posted on the Fox News Facebook page, right? Well, here is the response that the Christian community gives. I'll give you a couple of the lines excluding the cursing and bad language that you don't need to hear. But they said things like this, and I've got it documented in one of my books, Always Be Ready. They said, "Stupid waste of oxygen. Let's kill them all," talking about the atheists, "and they'll know that they're wrong. I can offend them with the Louisville Slugger to the back of their head." There's about 5 of those where the loving Christians get on and explain that if a person isn't a Christian, then that person needs to be hit with a bat in the head, needs to be shot with a 12-gauge shotgun, and there's all kinds of profanity throughout. Now, what do you think an unbelieving community does with that? Do you think that bothers them? Oh, well, not only does it bother them, but it gives them so much fodder for their cannons that they get on there, they all picture save, screenshot the thing, and they post it all over all of their different sites, and they say, this is loving Christianity. You think we're going to have an effect when we respond to an unbelieving world with that kind of venom? We're just not. So I think I don't know, you can't really say the first, you can't, but if you were to say, what do you have to make an impact on an unbelieving society? You've got to have a response that is correct, but it is given with meekness and fear. Now, I'll give you an example of that occurring. There is Penn Jillette is a star on an HBO program that has a cuss word in its name. And so I won't tell you the name of it, but it just says Penn and Teller and then a cuss word. And what they supposedly try to do is debunk a lot of stuff that people say is true, and lots of times they pick on religion. Now, just so happens that a lot of stuff that flies under the radar of religion actually should be debunked. Lots of the speaking in tongues and the weeping statues and a bunch of that stuff, okay, they actually have some valid points. But they then, instead of recognizing a division between New Testament Christianity and all the other stuff, they just lump it all in. But one program, you can see the little 5-minute video of this, Penn Jillette. He comes on YouTube afterward and he says, let me tell you what happened to me tonight. He said, now everybody knows I'm an atheist. He said, but after tonight's program, there was a guy who came up to me after the show, said he had a New Testament, and he had written his name, written his address in there. He looked me in the eye, shook my hand, and he gave it to me. And he said, I might have said, Mr. Jillette, Mr. Jillette, if you have any questions about what's in this Bible, my number's right there, you can call me. And Penn Jillette said, now he knows I'm an atheist. He said, but he was kind and he looked me in the eye and he sincerely wanted to, the word that Penn Jillette said was proselytize me. Knew I was an atheist, but he wanted to convert me. Now here's what I thought was so interesting. Penn Jillette said, and do you know, if a person really was a Christian and he really thought I'm not going to heaven, I'm going to hell, then the loving thing to do would be try to proselytize me. Now he said, I don't agree with him. I'm still an atheist. He said, but with a kind, good man like that, you can have that kind of deep disagreement. Now, all I'm trying to say is the world recognizes how you respond just as much or more than with what you respond. And our job in meeting a secular society is to not let the tone or method of our response push away the unbelievers because of the way we respond. Now, if the message does, if the fact that Jesus Christ came to die on the cross for their sins and you have to repent of those sins and leave it all before you walk through the narrow gate, if that message does, we're sorry. It's the greatest message ever delivered, and we give it to other people just like it was delivered to us. We're stewards of it. But if the method does, well, then we need to make sure we're wrapping our method with meekness and fear. I'm going to give you another way we're going to impact our society. If you were to listen to Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. He said, because nobody lights a lamp and puts it under a basket, but they put it on a lampstand so that it gives light to all who are in the house. Now, I was talking to several people, and especially Ashley, this evening about what the church here at Adamsville is doing. And we were talking about why it's the case that here in Adamsville today, we were invited into the school system to talk to them about their Creator and His awesome creatures, dinosaurs. And basically, Ashley mentioned the work that you do in this community and the work that you've done for that school. And how for the past 4, 5 years, you guys have had a work day and you have gone to that school. Don't know how many of you have been involved in that, but you have painted their walls, you have helped clear things out, you have taken chainsaws and cut trees off of that hiking trail behind the school so that they can continue to use that. Now, do you think when a school system sees a group of people called the church that is ready to lend a helping hand in their community, it makes a difference as to how their message is received? You don't have to take my word for that. When you listen to Jesus, He says, "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." Jesus Christ said one way that you make an impact on any society, especially a secular society, is you let them see you be about it and not just talk about it. Now, I think that's the kind of harvest you're reaping in this community because of what you have done in the past. And I would encourage you to continue and look for more opportunities to do that in the future, and you'll make even a greater difference. And let me take that back. God, through you, will make a difference in the community, because notice Jesus' instructions. Let them see your good works and pat you on the back for being such a nice guy. Is that what it says? Let them see your good works. Whose good works are they? They're yours. You're doing them. And let them glorify your Father who is in heaven. That church is a church that shows the love of God. Now, let me give you another thing that I think as the church we have to have in our approach in order for it to be effective. You've got to be teaching New Testament Christianity. Skeptics are great. They're outstanding at seeing holes in a false, wrong argument. Here's what I found. New Testament Christianity is the only defensible philosophy that there is on the market. It's the only one with no holes. Just like the character of Jesus Christ is the only one with no sin. There are no problems with, there are no philosophical holes in or soft spots in New Testament Christianity. But there are, you with me? But there are in things that aren't New Testament Christianity. Let me give you an example. Had a couple atheists, about 30, they were brothers. One of them was about 30, one about 32. And sat down with them at a Mexican restaurant. They were explaining to me why they can never be Christians. And I sat and listened, and they said, yeah, well, one of the reasons why we can't be Christians is because God's not fair. I said, really? I didn't say it like that. I said, well, would you explain to me what you mean by God not being fair? They said, yeah. They said, we can't believe that there's a God who would create people and then He would pick some of them to be elect and some of them to be reprobate, and He would take those elect people to heaven regardless of what they do, and He would send those reprobate people to hell regardless of what they do. And we just can't believe in a God that wouldn't let people make their own choices about eternity. And they went on about this for about 5 minutes. I sat and listened. At the end of it, I said, oh yeah, me neither. I wouldn't believe in God like that. Their eyes got big and they said, what do you mean you wouldn't believe in a God like that? I said, no, I wouldn't believe in a God who just creates people and He sends some of them to heaven, some of them to hell without them making any choices of their own. I said, no, I don't believe in that God. They said, yeah, you do. You got to. You're a Christian. I said, oh no, that's not Christianity. I said, there's a guy by the name of John Calvin who made that up. and said the Bible taught that, but the Bible doesn't teach that. And then I took them over to Ezekiel chapter 18, where I showed them the soul that sins shall die. The son shall not bear the guilt of the father, nor the father bear the guilt of the son, but each person who sins is the one that's going to die. And I said, I don't believe that. I don't believe that God picks some people to go to heaven regardless of what they do, or picks some people to go to hell regardless of what they do. And they sat there and said, in all our life, we've been involved with people that call themselves Christians our whole life, and we've never heard one person say that what we just said was not Christianity. Isn't that interesting? If we're going to defend the truth, we've got to know the truth. Do you know the truth? I heard any number of stories. I got about 5 like this. One's going to suffice for this evening, I think, though. About a group of about 13 young people. They were trying to convert one of their friends. He was an atheist. As they were telling me this, they said, you know how sometimes teenagers will do? They ended up at somebody's house or something like that, and they were all sitting out on the curb. And they were talking to him about how he needed to become a Christian, how he needed to give his life over to Jesus and obey Christ. About 13 of them there who were Christians, this one kid, he said, let me ask you a question. He said, have you read the Bible? You guys that are trying to convert me, you 13? They said, we hadn't read it all, no. Not one of them had read the whole Bible. He said, well, I have. And before you try to convert me to your God, you had better know more about your religion than I do. It's pretty tough, isn't it? I mean, we're going to a world and we're holding a book up that is 3,000 years old. And we're saying you need to follow the instructions in this book, which means you need to quit sleeping with your girlfriend, which means you need to quit getting drunk, which means you need to start teaching the doctrines of Christ, which means you need to cut off relationships that are getting in the way of your and God's relationship, and you need to start having a relationship with your Creator. And they're looking at this book you're holding out to them and saying, really, it's that important? What do you do with it? Oh, and then when they see, we're saying it's the most important book that anybody's ever penned, and it sits on our coffee table and gets less attention than our Flappy Bird video game on our iPhone. It's going to be hard to make a difference in that unbeliever's life when the book that we're saying is the greatest instruction manual for human life ever penned makes so little of a difference to us that we hardly pick it up during the week. Now, you've got to love the message. And that's why 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 15 says, but sanctify the Lord God in your hearts. The first instruction in your life before you ever take on the challenge to meet a secular world is to have a relationship with Jesus that is above and beyond any that you have with any other person. Have you put on Christ? By that I mean, have you repented of your sins and been buried in water baptism to be clothed with Christ? If you have, are you continuing in the faith, walking in the truth, so that the blood of Christ is continually cleansing you? Is there something you need to get right tonight so that you can honestly say with all of your heart that you've sanctified Jesus Christ in your heart and you're prepared to challenge a secular world? If there's something you need to do to respond to the Lord's invitation, I hope you will as we stand and as we sing.